going to introduce our second presenter. Dr. Kirstin Northenscold will be our second presenter, and if you were here for the first one, she was also a presenter in the first one. And just as a quick reminder, in case you weren't here, I'm going to do a little bit of an intro. So, as a distinguished researcher and program evaluator at the San Diego County Office of Education's Data and Impact Center of Excellence, Dr. Northenscold's work addresses some of the most pressing challenges in education, ranging from teacher retention and professional learning to chronic absenteeism and early childhood literacy. Her research not only informs policy, but also drives meaningful change in classrooms across the state. Before her current role, Dr. Northenscold was a faculty member and teaching and learning specialist at the San Diego Teacher Residency within High Tech High's Graduate School of Education, where she explored mentorship practices that support aspiring educators. With over a decade of experience as a high school English teacher, she brings both practical classroom insight and deep academic expertise to her work. We are fortunate to have her here again today to share her knowledge with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kirstin Northenscold.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'm excited to be here again with you all today, and I'll be talking about kind of continuing the conversation from last time, but if you weren't here last time, it's totally fine. I think you'll be able to jump right in as well. So just a brief overview of what we're going to be going through today. I'm going to be framing this in a story of a particular resident teacher that I worked with and really got to know closely and interviewed multiple times. And then I'll go into some conceptual grounding of the framework for mentorship that I'm going to be talking about today. We'll talk about some ways that we can really put it to practice in our work with mentor teachers and residencies. I'll present at the end like a arc of learning. What could you do? Lots of resources that you can take with you. Conclude the case study at the end, and then if there's any time at the end, we can also do any questions and comments. So that's a little overview of what this first section is going to look like. And the opening from Lisa couldn't have been, kind of better really to cue up the first part of what I'm going to talk about today. And in the first session a couple of weeks ago, I talked about residents' funds of knowledge, and ultimately, like so much of what Lisa was talking about in terms of how we think about families and communities is what we want our mentors to think about too with our residents, that they come bringing like incredible strengths. And those strengths are opportunities for us to support them in their learning to teach. So today I'm going to talk about, at the beginning here, Veronica, which is not actually her real name, but she's a real person. And this is not her real picture. But Veronica was a resident that I worked with. She was a middle school humanities resident. And she particularly was interested in teaching English, but she was getting her credential in English and social studies. And she came to the classroom with tons of strengths. And I think you would, if this resident came to your classroom or to your program, you would be like, yeah, this is amazing. I mean, she was a second career teacher. So she had a long career, not a fairly long career in journalism prior to entering teaching. She was bilingual in English and Spanish. She was a skilled writer and storyteller. Her mother is a special education advocate, and she was able to, throughout her whole childhood, see her mother's work and be kind of on the side of that and learn about what her mother did. And she's a Latina from the same town as the school that she was working in as a resident. So tons and tons of strengths, as I'm sure you can imagine and see right here. But as what happened with so many residents who were entering into their student teaching placements and their residencies, unfortunately, like what became, when she came into the classroom, mentor teachers who, these are mentor teachers who were kind and compassionate and wonderful people. But when they see residents come in, as I think you probably know, they see someone who doesn't know to teach yet. They see someone who has to learn so much. And so they end up seeing a lot of things that actually are deficits from their perspective. And so what they began to see was that, well, she doesn't know how to create lessons. She's had this career, but she's not making like strong lessons. And they expected her to be able to do that because she was a second career teacher. She was an older teacher, ultimately coming into the profession, and they expected more from her in that way. They felt like she was only interested in befriending her students, so she really prioritized relationship building, but they didn't see her really taking initiative with this lesson designing. They also felt like she was unwilling to use materials from the teacher, the mentor teacher. And I say they because there was a partner teacher group that was working with her, and it was actually her fieldwork supervisor and also her mentor teacher, and they were co-teachers together in the same department in this school. So it was like a little team. And they felt like there was a lack of dedication, motivation, and timeliness on her part. And perhaps you can imagine like all of these things happening, that potentially that like she felt lack of motivation and dedication at this point. And they also felt like she was immature given her age. They expected her to be more mature, given the fact that she was an older teacher and that she had this career prior to joining teaching. So this is what they ended up seeing instead of all of these strengths that had she had brought with her into the classroom. And I'm wondering from your perspectives, just where do you see opportunities for her to use her strengths to be successful in the classroom? And you can put this in the chat if you want to, but all the stuff that she brought into the classroom, she was excited to use and excited to, be partners with the mentor teachers. But as is so often the case, when resident teachers walk into the classroom, mentors don't see that. They see vessel that is just waiting to be filled up, which is, totally understandable, and probably their experience of student teaching as well. They probably came into teaching and they felt that way. They felt like they needed to learn so much and they didn't really bring much to the table. And the residents feel similarly, and mentors sort of perpetuate this pattern. Okay, so I'm going to return to this story of Veronica later, and it has actually like a really hopeful and wonderful conclusion to it. So just a little preview. In the last session, I talked about this mentorship framework that came about through my work with the San Diego Teacher Residency at High Tech High's Graduate School of Education. And we talked in our last session about centering resident teachers' funds of knowledge as a way, as just an essential starting point for this work. And today we're going to talk about the second two stances. And when I say stances, what I mean by that is like competencies or just like lenses through which mentors think about their work. That when they kind of stand in their place as a mentor, like these are things that are essential to them, essential beliefs. They're not necessarily skills, though definitely skills are involved with it. And I believe that stances are things that we can actually develop in our mentors, that it's not something that you either have or you don't have. That I really do believe that these are things that we can work with mentors to do more of and do less of other things. And we can do it in sometimes like technical ways, little iterative things that can make a really, really big difference. And that's what I hope to present to you today and for us to think about together. So the second stance that I believe mentors need to have to really support the thriving of residents is that they deliberately disrupt traditional hierarchies and power dynamics within the classroom. And then the third stance that I'll talk about today is that they intentionally design learning experience for their residents. They're really intentional about those learning experiences, as opposed to just having them experience teaching. They're thinking about structuring those experiences, scaffolding those experiences for their residents. So what I'm going to do in our session is talk about these two stances, and then I'm going to transition to presenting some ways that we could actually like develop these in our mentor teachers. And at any point, if you have any questions, please let me know. So first one we'll talk about is, again, stance 2, deliberately disrupting traditional hierarchies and power dynamics within the classroom. And so moving from this kind of classic hierarchy, not necessarily to consensus, but I like this little picture that I found online. And in the classroom, what this looks like, right, is we're moving away from this view of the mentor teacher as like the sage on the stage, where this person knows everything, and if I just took enough notes, I would be able to like be a good teacher just by, observing this individual from afar. And we're moving toward thinking about mentor teachers as partners in the classroom with the resident. And so in this picture, we have both individuals standing, working together, as opposed to just watching this person do the perfect performance of teaching that, of course, can never be replicated. And some of the things that our residents said as we were, collecting qualitative data on this that really resulted in this framework, they talked about how they felt like in situations where there was like a more traditional power dynamic in the classroom, they talked about feeling like an imposter. They didn't feel like they belonged. They felt like they were pretending and kind of like not a real teacher, and that they were constantly pretending to be a real teacher in the classroom. They said things like, and this is a direct quote from one resident in particular, "I'm treated like a student." Like he felt like he was just another student in the classroom, that he wasn't respected like a teacher. And with that, they talked a lot about respect, about feeling disrespected, about feeling the need for respect from the students. And sometimes this was because there was a very traditional power dynamic. And students, if they didn't respect the resident teacher, that was like, it felt especially bad in a situation where there was a very traditional power dynamic. Before I move on to the kind of opposite side of this, I'd love to know if, there's any reflections that you have on these words. Have you heard these before? Did these resonate with you at all? I'll just pause here for a second. You can either pop it in the chat or just like come off mute. How does this make you feel as you're thinking about, your residency program?
I can share. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's perfect.
So we have a section on imposter syndrome that we share with our residents and mentors, and just kind of reiterating the notion that like not to create many versions of the mentor, but to allow them to kind of step into their own identity and feel confident being the teacher that they would like to be, and not feeling like they have to replicate their mentor. So just kind of calling it out and like actually putting a name to it. And we saw that a lot of the residents kind of identified with that, and agreed that there's at times that feeling of feeling like like an imposter. But we shared kind of with both residents and mentors and tried to alleviate some of that, but just kind of calling it out at the very beginning of our year. So
It's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that, Serena. And do you feel like, just calling that out in some ways, do you feel like that's helped mentor teachers to understand like, oh, like I didn't even realize that this was happening?
I think so. I think there's a lot of pressure on them too to kind of create this, I guess for some of them, create like a high quality teacher, obviously, in the year that they have them. And so to kind of allow them to support the resident in a way that doesn't try to conform them or kind of pigeonhole them into the type of educator they are, but allowing the mentors to really try to unpack that a little bit more, and talk about that amongst themselves. We do like a kind of like a community of practice where like all of our mentors sit together in a circle and have open dialogue around these concepts. And so they did share, like, oh, that's interesting. Like that makes me feel a little less pressure to, get them to this level of, expert kind of expert teacher, because it, in turn has more of a detriment potentially to the resident if they do it in a way that creates a level of like super high expectation for them.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point that you bring up, that you know, mentor teachers feel a tremendous amount of pressure to support their residents and produce like a teacher who's ready to teach at the end, and that they feel so much pressure to, it's weirdly like a similar kind of imposter syndrome, that in like, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. They often talk, I don't know, in your experience as well, if they talk about like, well, what should I do? What's the right thing to do here? And this need to essentially do something they've never done before. And so the pressure that they feel, I think, is so important to acknowledge that as well, that they're taking that pressure off to say, like, actually, we're both learning, I think helps them in some ways to alleviate that. So thanks for bringing that up, Serena. So in some of the classrooms where there was disruption of traditional hierarchies in the classroom, the residents and the mentor teachers, they talked about being partners. They actually used the phrase co-teachers, and sometimes very, very deliberately. And so they would say, the mentor teacher would really enforce this almost with students and say, no, 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 we're co-teachers. We're not teachers. And this, this doesn't necessarily have to be the solution to the problem, but this was language that was used in situations where residents really felt empowered in the classroom to try things, to be themselves, to see themselves. I think someone wrote that in the chat, to see themselves, that it's so important for residents to be able to see themselves as teachers, even when they're not teachers yet, when they are residents. And one mentor teacher talked about how, like, yeah, she's learning how to do this thing, but we're both teachers. So in some ways, like even saying, even though she's not a credentialed teacher yet, she is a teacher in this space, in this classroom with me. And these were all classrooms where there was, so much sharing of ideas, of space, and these residents were extremely successful in these situations. And in the situations where they were feeling like imposters, or where they felt like they were students or lacking respect, and they were less successful, and ultimately did not persist as high of rates as those who were in these other situations. So just a little bit more about what this might look like. Okay, so we talked about this, like, can you see yourself as a teacher? And in situations where this wasn't the case, a resident is thinking they have to earn respect by actually becoming the mentor teacher. Like, they don't deserve respect from students and from the teacher and from the staff until they sort of like become this person. And we want to instead move towards treating teachers from the start as you are here as a teacher, and we're going to share power in this classroom. And I put this picture of the two computers because this was something that was extremely important to residents, was just, where is my spot? And I don't know if that's like in your experience with residences, with residents as well, but they want to know, like, where do I go in this room? And sometimes just having a space next to that looks like it's comparable and it's not like in a tiny cubby, like these things really matter and can signal that you deserve respect. And even, the moment you step in the classroom, just as our students do. And again, so what this is going to look like, and I'm going to go into more detail about this in a little bit, is that instead of just thinking about how I'm going to model best practice and the resident's going to observe it and they're just going to mimic it, we're thinking about co-leading and sharing that leadership in the classroom. Okay. Again, I'm going to go into what this could look like or how we can actually develop this later in this portion. But I wanted to introduce now, and again, this is kind of brain dump at the beginning here, but I wanted to now talk about this last stance about intentionally designing learning experiences. And I think these two really go hand in hand. So we want to think about moving away. This is like that traditional kind of classic release of responsibility towards something like a little messier. And this really gets to, Serena's point earlier about how, like, for mentor teachers, it's really scary to let go and to potentially engage in something that is ambiguous and messy as just being a mentor. And we have to be willing to have it be a little bit messier than this gradual release model that ultimately, like, it doesn't work with something like learning to teach, and perhaps doesn't work with a lot of things. So again, with the previous one, we talked about observing, kind of mimicking perfect practice. And with this one, so many of the traditional ways of thinking about mentorship is that we just passively observe this master teacher. We watch them do it perfectly for a long time. And then eventually we kind of gradually move away from that, where we do a little bit of what they do, we do a little bit more of what they do, and then eventually we're doing all of what they do. But it's essentially them that we've now become them in a way, and not ourselves as new teachers in the classroom. And instead, we want to move towards residents being engaged in their learning throughout the entire time, that they're actively learning, and that we're thinking about scaffolding that. So some of the things that residents said when we were conducting research and interviewing them as we were working on this framework, this resident that said third wheel is sort of an interesting perspective, because in the model that I was working in, teachers they actually like co-designed across departments. And so there were these two, very experienced teachers. They've been there forever, and they did all their planning together. And this resident talked about how she would show up to these meetings and just feel like the third wheel. Like, what role did she play? At some point they said, you don't even need to come to these meetings, because she was just kind of like bringing them down. She felt like she wasn't an active participant. She had ideas, but she couldn't actually contribute them. And so in a situation where this idea of third wheel, when it comes to planning, I guess you could definitely apply it to the way that teachers also talked about just trying to get into the thinking of their mentor teacher. They wanted to be part of the planning process, but it was never happening when they were there. It was happening on the way to work. It was happening when they're taking a shower. It was happening like all these different places where it was happening at like midnight the night before, very quickly and efficiently. And mentors knew that it was not going to be as efficient with a resident, and residents definitely felt that. They felt boxed out of planning. They also talked about, they used the phrase mimic teaching and mirror teaching, that instead of like learning how to teach, they were actually like replicating the exact processes of the teacher. They were trying to do the exact thing as perfectly as they could. And as opposed to like trying to figure out what it is that they're actually doing and learning the process. And they said things like, when a lesson maybe didn't go well, when they weren't able to exactly mimic what the teacher did, they would say things like it was a failure, or it was bad, or they would cry because of how it didn't go the same way. And they were comparing it to, their mentor teacher who had taught it the period before, different students, obviously, different person. And they couldn't do it the exact same way, and it felt like a failure. So I'm wondering now if we could just pause here and reflect on this. Is any of this from your experience in your residencies or your work so far in your residency? I know some of you are planning your implementation planning year right now. Is this resonating, and have you heard these kinds of phrases before? So Allison saying, yes, definitely hearing these. What we heard in classrooms where this wasn't happening, we heard of mentor teachers use phrases like, well, it's practice. They thought about like scaffolding the learning of the resident, as opposed to what do I need to do next tomorrow? It was, what does she need next? Where's her learning? Thinking almost about like her zone, like that teacher's zone of proximal development, right? Like, what's the next thing that teacher is needing to learn? And this is kind of a funny one, but it actually it was indicative of the way that teachers talked about and thought about practice. That one teacher said, well, there's actually a lot of wiggle room in my classroom and in my planning. And what that meant was there's room for trying something. There's room for failing and trying something. And this was a science classroom, and this teacher talked about the scientific method and how actually failure is hugely important in here. And the resident in this classroom was able to practice and try stuff out and see what worked, and almost like approach it as an experiment that then they learn from, as opposed to performance of perfection. So again, what this will look like, again, not perfectly performing. That's the only time you can take control. And that's kind of how these residents felt, is that, well, I'm not ready yet because I can't do it perfectly. And instead thinking about practicing in authentic situations from earlier in their residency. And, you know, engaging in like real practices, even when you're not skilled enough to do it at a professional level. And moving away from a gradual release model, which oftentimes involves a lot of mirroring of instruction, of replicating of instruction, toward more of an experiential learning model where you're doing it right away, you're starting right away, but not everything, but you're doing things that you can be successful at and that you can learn, and the experiences are scaffolded. Okay, so I want to move now to thinking about what can we actually do to support our mentor teachers. I'm going to share some strategies and some actual like concrete tools that we can use. And then I also have a couple of times in here where I want us to engage a little bit and hopefully come off mute, and we'll talk a little bit about a couple of questions. So I'm going to present 3 different tools or strategies that I think you can use to begin to develop these perspectives and stances. While it would be great to have mentor teachers who have everything that you want, the reality is that you're going to have mentor teachers who are there for the right reasons. They're really interested in mentorship, but they don't know how to do this because they've never done it before. And what they do know how to do is teach really well. And unfortunately, what oftentimes happens in those situations is if you know how to teach really, really well, sometimes it's hard as an expert to step back from that and think about what novices really need in the moment to be successful and to thrive. And so these are strategies that I think you can use with those mentors to help them feel successful and to help their residents feel successful. The first one is connected to funds of knowledge, which I talked about in the first session and a little bit at the beginning here with the case study Veronica. But one strategy that I think can be successful to really support residents is to bridge between residents' funds of knowledge, build bridges essentially, and the curriculum and pedagogical moves in the classroom. So be really deliberate about that in how you're thinking about what I teach as a mentor teacher and how I teach. And I'll go through each of these in the next couple slides. The next one is that co-teaching and co-planning, while really difficult, and there are so many barriers that get in the way of this happening effectively, this in and of itself can be a really productive strategy, and co-planning I think is essential as a way of, early on in this session, I forget who wrote in the chat that reflection, self-reflection was like a necessary trait in mentor teachers. Can't remember who wrote that in the chat, but I was like, yes, I totally agree with that. And so much of planning is like a reflective process and practice that you want to let your resident teachers be part of. And then lastly, this is a very technical solution to a more complex problem, but physical and spatial choices can do a lot to indicate respect and belonging. And there's sort of low-hanging fruit right now that, you know, like if you're going to work on these big things, but you can also do some pretty small things that have a big impact on the way that residents feel in the classroom and when they're entering the classroom every single day, and how they begin to see themselves as teachers in that classroom. Okay, so this tool it's modified from a really wonderful resource that's linked on the bottom of the page that's for students from the Washington Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, which takes some of the research around funds of knowledge and built it out into a matrix that you can use as a teacher working with students, where you're thinking about like documenting what are this. In my first session, I talked about how mentor teachers have to actually like really do some like ethnographic work where they're like listening deeply to their residents. They're learning about their residents, and they're not just learning about it to, you know, build kind of a superficial relationship at the beginning, but they're really thinking like, okay, what is everything that my resident comes here with, as opposed to like, what don't they have, which is I think how they oftentimes approach it. And it's just because they're trying to figure out very quickly, what do I need to do? How do I need to fill in these things? And instead framing it as, what do they have? And how can I use that really effectively? So the matrix is yours. You can make a copy of it if you click the actual document in the slides. And I also have it in a document at the end, where you can fill in and change the categories if you want to as well. But what are some home or community or just individual practices that this resident brings from their experience? And what could you teach that would connect to it? And this is, I think, oftentimes where the thinking stops, where it's sort of, it's like, well, like there's a content application of the practice. And that is so important to base what you're teaching on some of the strengths. But I understand that it's not always that flexibility in where mentor teachers are teaching. I was teaching in a context where working with a context that was highly flexible in terms of their content creation. They were creating their content. And so this was possible, but sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes you have to teach what you're teaching. And so how could you design instruction that would align with some of these strengths that the resident brings? And this, I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that could look like. I wanted to just go back to Veronica for a second. And I went through here, and again, this is an individual that I know pretty deeply, so I have a lot of information on her, but these are things that I think came out pretty early on. And I put a bunch of her just strengths that she brought with her that were from her childhood, from where she grew up, from her own interests, her current community, her current home, and put them here in the home community practices column. So she's an avid hiker, really likes deserts. She keeps a blog on her adventures. And this was in her application for our residency program. And so we immediately had this information. I didn't have to do very much digging at all to get to that one. She linked it in her application. She's bilingual English and Spanish speaker. This, again, in her application, crochets, clothing, and blankets. Pretty early on, this because she wears it, and actual crocheted clothing. Her husband works in the restaurant industry, and they cook a lot. That came out a little bit later. She competes in storytelling performances, and she has deep knowledge of special education advocacy and law from observing her mother's work throughout her whole life. So I thought of one content application. And again, if I were the mentor teacher here, I could use this matrix and just keep track and add a row when I need to, because there's, people are complex and they have a lot of things under each of these things, each of these categories. And you could keep adding more. But I would want to start thinking here, like, okay, I want to keep this in my back pocket. How could I use what I'm teaching in class to build on the strengths, to make bridges between what she already knows and what she brings with her, so that it's not totally new. So she doesn't feel like the kind of empty, like vessel that only can be filled. She brings something to the table. And so let's say I'm going to teach a unit on disability civil rights movement. That would be a perfect opportunity. I would write that in there. Or if I wanted to teach that unit, now would be a great time to do that, right? Because I have someone in the room who has a lot of expertise and can bring so much to the table for that. And then for a pedagogical application up here under sports, she's an avid hiker. And with hiking, you need to depend on each other. This might be a little bit of a stretch, but I'm not sure. I think it might work. That she might be able to design collaborative team activities really well. That might be something, given the fact that she likes hiking in situations like deserts where you really need to depend on each other, plan ahead and collaborate. She might be able to design collaborative team activities based on that. Okay, now is when I'm going to ask you to come off mute and tell me, or you can, well, let's not do it in the chat. Let's come off mute a little bit here. If you prefer not to, you can drop it in the chat too. What other potential content applications do you see based on Veronica's strengths that she brings to the table, or pedagogical applications where you could design a lesson in a way that you think she might be able to do based off of the strength that she brings to the table here? you can pop it in the chat or come off mute. I'd love to get a couple more on here, just so we know, like, okay, like we could actually, work with mentors on this and help them to think through this as well.
I was thinking for the section where it says art and she crochets clothing, that she might be able to come up with a passion project to see what some of the other students are really interested in or do incredibly well, and then have them maybe dig a little deeper and maybe bring some things in and make some things, and then kind of do a showcase of some of their artistic interests.
I love that. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing that with these. Any other ideas? You can come off mute or you can put in the chat. Where else do you see opportunities for content application or a pedagogical application?
There's really so much that you could draw from, honestly, when I'm looking at this, honestly. I would say the technology piece, like keeping a blog on her hiking adventures, to me, that's really related to writing and being able to summarize a specific experience, personal narrative, especially. And then also one thing that just jumped right out to me is, yes, Marisa I was thinking about that too, Marisa, cooking. Cooking has so much math involved in it, and it's a great way to engage people and really access that cultural just responsiveness to the community. Um, yeah, and there's just a ton of math, and students really get engaged, and it's fun. It's a way to experiment and try new things out.
Thanks so much, Heather. And thanks, Marissa, too, with the fractions and chemical reactions in the chat. Definitely. She was a humanities candidate, but there was a lot of like collaboration, and that could have been a great opportunity to bring in the science teacher to do something like a project that, was cross interdisciplinary project. Love that. One thing I was thinking about for the pedagogical application for this one too is that, she's been at the dining table for her whole life listening to her mom's work. I feel like she could potentially really be strong on one-on-one work with students, potentially differentiation, individualization of instruction. She deeply believes in that. And so I think that could be something that maybe you could pull out as a pedagogical application here as well. I wanted just to consider here for a second, so often we do tend to gravitate toward like content selection, but I wanted to think a little bit with this group about why should mentor teachers try to connect their strengths, not just to content selection, but also pedagogical moves. From your perspective, how do you think this could support residents to be successful? Not just content, but also like the pedagogical moves in the classroom, like small group instruction. How am I going to teach this thing that I'm doing? Things like that are so difficult to learn as residents, as novice teachers. You can put it in the chat, or if you'd like to come off mute too, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
One thing that this question makes me think about, Kirstin, is the identity development of residents as they're kind of developing that identity around teaching. And I think a lot of times one thing that they bring to the classroom is, like you said, they don't see themselves as teachers yet. And so really connecting what they know to the pedagogical move that could support that, I think is additional connection that serves them and kind of building them up and developing that efficacy while they're developing their understanding of, okay, who am I as a teacher? What do I have to offer this space? And then that kind of reaffirms this whole idea of like, oh, okay, yeah, I do have something to offer. Oh yeah, I can like draw from this prior knowledge that I'm bringing into the classroom.
Exactly. Yeah. That even in teaching, you have something to offer, not just in, the content experiences that you have, but like as a teacher, you do actually have some things already. And that identity piece is so huge to see yourself in that role. Okay, so I'm going to move to a short video here that is switching gears from, now we're moving from the previous section on, bridging to strengths to thinking. Oh, I just saw in the chat too. I know have to give you time to write a little bit, but Marissa wrote, yes, in response to Heather's comment. I was thinking of the resident who might always be critical of themselves, and that this allows them to build on what they feel confident at. Yes, definitely. And especially, I mean, if you feel confident in something that is teaching, like that cognitive load, like just it lessens that. You don't have to worry about every single thing. You just have to worry about this one thing, you know, and sometimes that one thing is content, and sometimes that one thing is, you know, teaching practices and instructional moves, but it's really hard when it's both of those things at the same time, all the time, every single day. And yes, and Kate says at the basic level, it's also relationship building, 100%. So essential in that feeling like you can actually learn in this classroom. Okay, so the video that I have here for you, it's about a 5-minute video, and I wanted you to look for the things that I have on the right-hand side of the slide. And this is a video about co-planning and co-teaching. It's not perfect, but I think it's helpful, and you could definitely use it if you wanted to in your own work with mentor teachers. So I want you to notice, where are you seeing sharing physical space of the classroom, any kind of signals of respect between teachers, disruptions of traditional hierarchy in the classroom, opportunities for the student teachers to practice in low risk situations, and then reflective practice. Okay, so those are the things I'm asking you to look for during this, and I think those should stay up when I press. And please come off mute right away if you can't hear anything. Okay, promise?
Going to have 3 stations today, you guys. Okay, Mr. Keeper.
All right, it's station 1 with myself, Yusuf, Abby.
With co-teaching, since we started its implementation, it's really strengthened the learning process for our student teachers and made a positive impact on the students' learning. It decreases the group size and allows more interaction between both the teacher and the students, as well as the students and their peers. The lab school partners with the College of Ed as part of the Teacher Education Institute to help prepare teachers.
Are humans bound to destroy themselves? That's a question, right?
So we get utilized heavily for a lot of the pre-service teachers' practicum experiences.
We're gonna be on an adventure.
Because of that, the teachers here have become masterful at really utilizing all the adults to make a positive difference for the students that they serve.
Co-teaching is when 2 or more teachers work together in all aspects of instruction. So from planning to instruction to assessment.
We're just gonna take a look at your writing, your exit ticket from yesterday.
There are always 2 teachers in the room working with students.
What elements of modern warfare do you see in Wayne's letter?
Okay, good.
We were given this list of strategies in our training, and we were just asked to think about any way that we could try to draw on those as much as possible. So a lot of it is looking at those strategies and trying to match it with what the kids need. We're gonna be in about groups of 4. Okay, everybody's going to go to all 3 rotations. All right, let's do it.
We're discussing all 4 of these pictures and what you guys came up with.
During station teaching, each of the teachers has an individual station with a different lesson plan, and students are working independently at a station.
All right, we're going to rotate now, folks.
And it is very valuable for our student teachers to teach the same lesson numerous times. They make little small tweaks with every lesson.
What sticks out to you when you're looking at this? Can you tell me more? I think the great thing about co-teaching is that having the burden not necessarily 100% put on you right from the start is almost a great way to have training wheels if you're coming in and you don't have a lot of teaching experience. And good teaching can be good teaching whether it's 2 kids or 4, but it's easier definitely to manage your bodies. So that's kind of one of the things that Sarah Teasdale's seen.
Bradbury's writing about 20 years after Teasdale. I mean, it's what's best for kids, right? They can work with me and Isaac all in the same hour. Kids aren't going to fall through the cracks. They're going to have lots of ways for us to reach our kids. They both have different teaching styles, but they work well together. So if you don't understand one thing, as Beverly said, you can ask Mr. Kiefer and he'll tell you it in a different way.
To be effective at co-teaching, there has to be co-planning.
So today we're going to do our role playing. So we're going to be co-teaching that.
And we're gonna assist them with filling out their presentation.
Yes.
We plan everything together, which helps me, because through the planning process, I can ask her questions so that when I'm on my own, I know what to expect.
Great. So thanks for watching that. Just a quick video. And these are the same questions as the previous slide, but if you could either in the chat or also, I think it'd be great to come off mute right now and just share when did you notice some of these different components of sharing power and also learning design? So sharing physical space, signals of respect between teachers, disruptions of traditional hierarchy, or also opportunities for them to learn and practice in low risk situations, and then reflective practice. And Kate puts in the chat, to be effective at co-teaching, there has to be co-planning. Yes. Awesome. So in the chat from Louise, we have signal of respect. Student felt comfortable asking either teacher question, knowing that one could respond differently. That might help. Totally. That the way that the students approached both of the teachers showed that they valued both teachers' perspectives and they saw them as co-teachers in the classroom. That's huge. I love that. What else did you notice in terms of any of these different questions that I asked you to be thinking about as you were watching?
I love that she was like, there's no, like, I can't remember exactly how she said it, what the language was, but it was basically like, it doesn't hurt the students to get more time with a teacher. And just like the way that she said it means that she's treating that resident as a teacher, like a co-teacher, like they are both doing the instruction and it will benefit the students like greatly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and in those, great. So Marissa says low risk can be with small group. Definitely, that's exactly, I was just gonna say that. Yeah, low risk can be with small group, working with intentional student grouping, definitely. So that not everyone has to see you do this thing for practice, just these like 5 students. And then you get to do it again with another 5 students and you learn from that experience and you get to do it again and constantly practicing this. And you're not doing the exact same thing that the co-teacher, the mentor teacher is doing in the classroom. But those low risk opportunities to try things and then reflect on it ultimately too. If there's anything else, feel free to pop it in the chat. Oh, great. Jennifer's got movement and space in the classroom was shared and comfortable. Yes. Jennifer, I'm wondering if you could just share like either in the chat or verbally, it doesn't matter, either one, or anyone can hop in here. What told you that? Like, what did you see that showed you that it was comfortable or that you noticed that it was shared?
And going to quite a few classrooms and observing just that idea of one's not standing in the back or the hesitation or the constant look over it. Someone else is like, is this okay? Is this okay? But that there was an equal respect for each other that you could see when they were moving and kind of engaging with one another, that they had kind of with that co-teach, co-plan in advance, kind of worked that out. So it didn't feel like somebody was always looking for permission to step in, but that there was, you know, with even visually watching them move around the classroom, kind of an ease with working alongside each other.
Totally. Thanks so much for sharing that, Jennifer. And you can even see like in this little screenshot of the video that they're doing co-planning, but this is at a table that students use. So it's not, you know, sidling up next to the teacher's desk and like trying to get into the conversation in some way, that they're both have the materials out, they're both looking at it, they're looking at similar documents and talking and sharing those together. And one more in the chat from Louise, focus on modeling. Resident is learning not to be the sage on the stage. They had a student-focused environment. It's such a wonderful point that I hadn't thought about. That's why, you know, I'm here with this group to learn from you as well, that that they're actually through that, it's like a symmetrical kind of reciprocal situation, that they're learning not just how to be treated, but also how to treat students as they move forward, and ideally have classrooms that model these same values in a student-focused instruction. Thank you so much for engaging in that. I'm going to move forward because I want to make sure that I get through the rest of my slides here, and some of them are just resources that they're just offerings for you. But there's a lot of really wonderful work from Sharon Feynman Nemser. She's out of Brandeis, and she's researched this co-planning and co-teaching and mentorship, participatory mentorship for many, many, many years. And she's just wonderful. And I just wanted to give you this quote here from her on this idea of mentoring as a joint participation in authentic activity. and how it differs from more conventional views of mentoring. And when mentoring takes the form of joint participation in authentic activity, the primary purpose is to accomplish the task, just like what we saw in the video where they're actually trying to plan the lesson. It's not that they're trying to talk through the mentor's lesson and like think through every single iteration. They're actually planning it. They're accomplishing that. They're actually teaching the lesson when they teach, when they co-teach. The novice's learning results from their participation with the mentor in this activity. And this was going to be a discussion. I think we're going to move past it though, but I was curious. I'll just leave it out there. And if you want to put it in the chat, you can, but we'll keep moving forward beyond it. I wanted you to think just like, how does this kind of participatory mentoring differ from more traditional forms of teacher mentoring that you've seen, or maybe that you've been part of as, novice teachers long ago? And it is quite different. And you're asking, mentors to do something very different and potentially frightening. One thing that can be frightening is co-planning. And it's, a lot of barriers that exist there. And I was curious, from your experience, like what might prevent teachers from co-planning with residents? But just in the chat, like really quickly, one word, what do you think could prevent teachers from co-planning? Time, yes, time. Yeah, it's the biggest one, right? And the time that it takes to do this, to do it well. Insecurity, interesting. Louise, would you feel comfortable just coming off chat briefly and saying, like, what do you think might come up there in terms of insecurity for mentor teachers?
Okay, what I meant by that is we might have a teacher who's a veteran and they've been doing this work for a long time and they found some moves that work very well for them, but they may be aware that there are other things that they don't do as well, like AI is being introduced on the academic stage, and we saw in the video that very student-centered environment. And maybe they still have roles. So maybe they're aware of some things that they don't do as well that they could or that they should, but maybe they don't have time to do it. And so if they had someone in their classroom who was younger and who could do some of these things, it might just make them feel a little insecure about their role as, particularly if they are still operating with the hierarchy framework. So that's what I meant by that.
Yes. Yeah, I appreciate that. Kind of unpacking that a little bit. And I think I 100% agree. And I imagine others in the room do as well with that, exactly that, what you just described. And if they are operating, as you said, in that kind of hierarchical relationship with their resident, they have to know everything. Otherwise, like, why do they exist as a mentor teacher? And so then there's this like terrible cycle of, well, then I have to hide these things from my residents so that they don't see this thing. Otherwise, they won't trust me as a mentor teacher. It's this like really awful cycle, as opposed to both thinking about learning together. Yes, and a lack of relationship, understanding of best practice. Yes, without that relationship, it's so hard to engage in these conversations. If you actually don't trust each other, then you can do all these other things, but you're not actually, the resident won't actually bring their authentic self to the table to engage and won't be able to learn deeply. And if there's anything that you've learned in your context that supported co-planning, I'd love for you to put it in the chat because, again, this is a great opportunity to learn from each other. So put it in the chat, just what have you done so far that you think has supported co-planning or co-teaching too? And I'm going to move forward and I'm not going to go through this fully, but I just wanted to, just like an offering of an organizer, a co-planning organizer that can potentially help teachers, mentor teachers, work through a number of questions that could guide them if they haven't done co-planning before. And this is based on some of what Feynman Nemser found in what teachers did who co-planned well. They did these three things. They started thinking about who they were as co-learners. What do they want to do? What do they want to teach as co-learners? They both brought things to this table. And then they worked on designing together, just like we saw in the video, as partners. How will they design the lesson? What are they going to do? Step by step, what are we thinking? Maybe we're using a lesson design framework or template here. Again, thinking about the pedagogical strengths of the resident that we've already elicited through our conversations with them. And then the last step is an interesting one. It's more like expert working with novice. This is where we're really thinking about, here's where we might model more in a coaching for teaching space, where we might rehearse the lesson with the resident. We need to make our thinking visible for the resident in this stage of it. So these are 3 things that Feynman Nemser found that mentor teachers who really worked as like these partners in their teaching with their student teachers, that they did these 3 things. So if you click on it, it takes you to a page where it'll copy this for you. Feel free to use it, just an offering for you all. And then the very last thing I want to talk about today was sharing power. We've talked about this a lot already, and I just have a couple of resources here around this. And this, again, there's some, much deeper work that can be done, and there's also work that's more spatial that I'll talk about in this. But when people share power, as liberatory design says, and this is a really wonderful resource for you to use too in your work with mentors, when they share power, instead of having it wielded over or against them, they could be more human and authentic. And it's really what we want our residents to feel in the classroom. And when they're more human and authentic, they can learn. And the question then, I was gonna have a discussion, but we don't have time for this. So just how could mentor teachers share and transform power with residents and students? I think we've actually already raised a lot of examples of this. When we were talking about the video, we saw examples of sharing and transforming power with the resident and students in the classroom. But in this picture specifically, as if you were a resident teacher walking into this classroom, I'm curious, like, what would be some of your fears, thoughts right away? Like, you open the door, you're coming in, what would you be thinking right away when you enter this room? And just like, you can just come off chat and shout it out, or you can just put like a couple words in the chat. It's your day 1, you've entered this room. There's not necessarily a right answer or a wrong answer, but
I would automatically think like, oh my gosh, I have to stand in front of all these kids. I don't know, next to this teacher who they clearly like listen to. I don't know, it would just be maybe intimidating.
Might be intimidating. Yeah, the lack of equity or sage on the stage, definitely. And I think like in my work with residents too, they are become very concerned about like, where do I go? Like, where do I go in this? Where do I stand next to her? Do I stand in the back? Do I lurk? Do I sit? Like, where's my space in this? And this is one of those situations that is more of a technical fix, but is kind of a low-hanging fruit to think about, and ultimately is connected very deeply to practice and to how we see students and how we see. So it's not just like a technical fix, but I'll talk a little bit about this in just a second. And then the second one, and we don't have to go off mute for this, but when you are a resident and you come up to your mentor teacher's classroom, your mentor teacher is Miss Bowman, and it's day 1, and this is what you see. This is like a very small technical welcoming fix that mentor teachers and schools can do, that not just are you welcome to Miss Bowman's class, but you're also welcome to Miss Bowman and Miss Northenscold's class, so that both of you are in this class, and that it's not like a little tiny note next to the big note, which I've seen as well. One way, like I said, is just welcome to our classroom. Find a way to have that small shift. It is like very meaningful to residents, and it's low-hanging fruit. Both names on the thing, our classroom. Have a space for them to both be together, to sit, make sure that the mentor teacher's thinking about where can there be a space for my resident that signals to them that I value them, that I've thought about them, and that it's not at a desk in the back that's the same desk as what students potentially use, and that it's close, and that we can actually communicate, and that I like them. Deeper ways of thinking about this is using protocols to really like explore power in the classroom. And this obviously is getting away from like low-hanging fruit and getting towards like deeper practices that allow the entire class to explore power. And then lastly, if you click on this picture in the right-hand corner, it takes you to this page, Liberating Structures, which is a really wonderful resource to think about how do people interact together in a space. So there's many, many wonderful protocols on that page that can help you to help mentor teachers to think about like small group instruction, protocols for small groups, so that it's not just one person talking to the full group. Last but not least, I've got a bunch of resources here on a document. They're all organized according to different stances. So I just want you to know that this exists for you to explore and to use. And I wanted to end by just saying that Veronica, our case study, it took a couple years, truthfully, it took a couple years, couple of schools for her to figure out and kind of to find her place. But she is teaching middle school now in the school district that her mom worked in for her mom's entire life, and is thriving, is so happy. She's just like loving it and having such a wonderful time. And so I do want to like a hopeful ending that there is even in the situation of Veronica, where so many things were difficult, there's such strength in her that she found a place. And she found a place where she could be successful and is creating these kind of spaces for her students today. So I just thank you so much for your time today. I think that's it for me. So I will pass it over. I'm going to stop sharing at this point. And if you do have any questions or anything, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll be here. And feel free to reach out whenever. I can put my email in the chat too. And I'm a resource for you. So thank you for your time.
Kirstin, can I just add some things, just some comments that I was thinking about as you were, unfolding your presentation? We just hosted a Southern Regional site visit here in Northern LA at Residency program, excuse me, called Puck. And they were really showcasing their co-teaching model and kind of organically, I think, touched on some of the things that you were unpacking. But one of the kind of takeaways that I came away from it was, as not being able to, we were doing these class observations, we were walking into the different classrooms. We weren't there for very long, maybe for 8 minutes, 5 to 8 minutes in each classroom. But there was an immediate sense that when you walked in the classroom, first of all, you couldn't tell who was the resident and who was the teacher. But also there were kind of like, going back to your initial point around sharing space and how important that is, and how that's like one critical way to disrupt power dynamics with your resident, but also, amongst students as well. But when we walked in the space, we didn't know who was who, like who was the resident, who was the mentor teacher, but that there was 2 desks in each classroom. And then there was people did several like Bitmoji images where they were kind of presenting both of the teachers in the Bitmoji. You know how they have those Bitmojis? That's like a way to like engage with the students. And I just felt like it was such a powerful way to communicate the dynamics of what was happening in the classroom and the teaching that was happening and what the students can expect when they walk into that classroom. And I think that those little things, those little subtle little things really can communicate so much to all stakeholders, and that, don't underestimate those little things. So I just wanted to offer that because I got to see some of those things in action, and it was a real aha moment for me.
That's so cool. I love that. Like, you don't know who the mentor teacher is, who the resident is, like that I feel like is a great question to use as like you're observing instruction like that. Thanks for sharing that, Heather.
I will just say we had a similar experience in the northern region too. We saw the same thing in the northern region where there was like one classroom in particular we walked into and nobody could tell like who the mentor was and who was the resident. And like that was really powerful to see, because I think we always talk about that, but to be able to actually see it in action is like, it's just really, really powerful. Thank you so much, Dr. Northenscold.